Be sure to head to flipsidegaming.com and use promo code 6 for 10% off on orders. Over $10 is a good deal and helps support the show. What is up, Planeswalkers, Therox 6? Back with some more Magic the Gathering, and today we're going to be talking about, well, technically this video should have came out yesterday, but I was busy. It's fine. This is a bonus video. You'll get another video tonight, or today. Time travel's fun. Anyway, today we're going to be talking about 7 decks that have cores that are rotation proof. And now when I say rotation proof, what I mean is the main bulk of the deck, the main makeup of the deck is going to remain after rotation. And what I did essentially is I went to MTG Goldfish and I looked at some of the highest performing decks on the standard metagame. And I thought, I looked at how many of these cards are rotating and how much does that affect the deck. So I came away with 7 different decks, that seem to be, for the most part, okay. Now, obviously, I need to put a little stipulation here. This ignores completely the cards that are coming with Throne of Eldraine. And Throne of Eldraine is going to modify how Standard looks. That said, this is meant to be a relatively safe core of cards, cores for decks, that will have its base cards, its base skeleton, be usable come rotation. Okay. With that out of the way, let's jump to the decks. And essentially, I'm going to talk about what these decks are, which of the cards are leaving, and if I have some suggestions about what to do, what replacements you might want, etc., etc. So this is a Yarok deck. Now, obviously, I went like full-on bare bones here. I took out all of the numbers of these cards because the numbers aren't going to necessarily matter because they will likely change. For example, in this deck, I think it was like 4, 4, 4, and like one of these, but you know, things might change. So this essentially is a Yarok field deck. Now, it runs Field of the Dead, but it did not run Scapeshift initially, and that's good because this means that this deck doesn't rely on Scapeshift. It more just plays a long game with things like Risen Reef and Cavalier of Thorns to get your lands out over time and become a value deck. I did talk about this a little bit when I was talking about the cards that were rotating and which ones I liked and didn't like to seek leave. And I did say that you still are going to see Field of the Dead. I'm still relatively sure about that, but you're going to see it in more of a long game value oriented deck instead of something that's super explosive. Now, this is the more value oriented deck. I will talk about Bant Scapeshift and how I think that is going to be modified come rotation. But this deck, as you can see, is still fine by itself. Right? It has control elements with Disfigure, Thought Erasure, and Assassin's Trophy. And it still has its main cards, you know, Arboreal Grazer, Risen Reef, Cavalier, etc. The cards it's losing are over here. In the main deck, you're mostly losing lands. They had a single one of Nexus. It wasn't super important, integral to the deck at all, so I don't think this is going to be an issue. But the Elvish Rejuvenator is something that we'll see again and again here, that losing this is going to be a little bit unfortunate for decks that are looking to ramp. Now, this isn't technically a ramp deck in that its main strategy isn't to get to some big X spell, right? It's just to get a bunch of lands out. You can replace this with District Guide, although I'm looking to see something potentially that is going to come out of Throne of Eldraine, which is going to be a direct replacement for this in some way, because this being able to get you lands directly into play matters a lot more than... I literally just named the card. Whatever, the Guild Lady, to put the card in your hand. That said, this is like the only real card that you're losing from the deck in the main deck. So this deck essentially remains the same. The biggest loss for this deck is in the mana base. Now, Memorial to Genius, this is something that is a little unfortunate. The deck only played 1. So losing it is going to suck in those random cases where you just need some more card draw. But I think that moving into a little bit more of a value version of this deck, you might end up seeing throwing in some Hydrocrisis for that kind of replacement effect where you're going to have a lot of mana still. And in order to, maintain getting advantage out of that, we're probably going to start seeing some X-Spells in this version of the deck. You could also just see a little bit more heavily reliance on Yarok, throwing in different ETB triggers that are either in Standard right now from one of the non-rotating sets, or will come with Throne of Eldraine. The rest, though, Drowned Catacombs, Woodland Cemetery, and Hinterland Harbor, these are leaving. These are good old-fashioned mana fixing, and I'm not sure what is going to replace the checklands. And that, as I said with the rotation video, is really going to determine what these decks kind of shape up looking like, because, this now has this number of black-green, but it has this number of black-blue, potentially. Obviously, this isn't running the Guild Gate, but it's still running like Jungle Hall and stuff. So we really need to see that. And then, of course, Arch of Rossi and Field of Ruin are actually potentially a big hit. And Field of Ruin, I think, is a bigger hit that I did forget to talk about. The reason for that is, as I said, I still think that Field of the Dead is going to see a lot of play. And losing Field of Ruin means that we don't have a way that is easily able to destroy Field of the Dead. So that might be an issue. We're also losing Memorial to War for what it's worth, but that card doesn't matter as much. So we might actually see more Bedazzle. Why is there a card called Bedevil in the same colors? we might see a little bit more of that, just so we can counter these good old-fashioned Field of the Deads. Yeah, and then of course Arch of Ruska is a little bit more draw, and that's kind of what I mean with potentially bringing in some Hydro Crazies. But as it is, I think this is a relatively safe deck to craft into. Even if you don't end up playing the deck as is, Yarok, very fun card. You're likely going to be playing this in Brawl if you like value. I know I do, so I will be playing this in Brawl. But the rest of these cards are still decent in their own right. You know, Tameo can go into a bunch of different decks. Self-Mill in particular, Cavalier of Thorns and Risen Reef still work in an elemental deck. And of course, Assassin's Trophy is just premium removal regardless, and Thought Eraser is just played pretty much everywhere. So that is first of the safe picks, and these aren't in any particular order. Technically, they're in reverse order of rank on MTG Goldfish, so technically this is the most played, then blah blah blah. Temur Elementals is next up. You'll see, I think, actually, I'm gonna point this out. A lot of greens and blues. I guess there's a decent amount of white as well. Yeah, okay, there's a decent amount of white as well. But still, Temur Elementals is losing almost nothing, and that frightens me a little. So as you can see, Temur Elementals loses Lenarelf and 2 lands. That's it. Unless I've missed something, which I don't believe I did, because I like double checked this. Oh, I saw the Ixalan set symbol. I was like, I missed something. No, they are losing functionally nothing. The Lenarelf loss is going to be an issue because it does mean that they're not going to be able to jump straight into Risen Reef, and it means that they're going to have a slightly harder time to get to really early game Nissas. That said, this is still a solid deck. Having good ramp packages, decent removal, fucking mass manipulations, 2 of the better planeswalkers in the format right now, two of the better high-cost planeswalkers in the format. I essentially have to say it like that. This deck is still going to see a lot of play, and I think a lot of that is due to the fact that it's losing 3 cards. 2 of them are lands that technically the deck doesn't super need, because we are getting the Temple from this, and then of course the red-green. Red is the off color. Obviously, like, they have Chandra, they have Lava Coil, but red is still the off color. It's overwhelmingly green and technically blue because of mass manipulation. So I think that this deck is, if you're looking for a deck that you can just keep playing, and you're not really going to have to worry too much about Throne of Eldraine messing things up for you, this deck I think is going to be super fine, and the value that's implicit in a deck like this, I think, leads to it being pretty resilient on day one. Obviously, we're going to see a lot of aggro decks day one, because that's usually what we see. We see a lot of super aggressive decks taking advantage of other people playing super value decks. And I think this is a nice deck that's in the middle, because you have a lot of ramp, which can deal with those really annoying aggro opponents where you can just get out ahead of them, make big Cavaliers, make Omnaths, steal all their creatures, etc., while still having enough value from your Nissas, your Chandras, and your Hydro Crasis and whatnot to compete with those super janky decks that we usually see directly post-rotation. Now, does this deck die if Throne of Eldraine has something in particular? I don't think so. I can't think of any archetype that's really going to hinder this, except maybe if there's a really good popular card that stops lands from being put in from anywhere but the hand. But that seems incredibly narrow, and I doubt that will be the case. So I think this is a really safe bet in terms of decks that you might want to craft and still have after rotation. Next up, surprisingly, is a good old-fashioned Phoenix deck, because we still have Shock. This is M19 because I got lazy and didn't want to keep changing it from the card style, but M20 did reprint Shock. It did not reprint Lightning Strike, which is unfortunate, and it is one of the cards that we lose. And the deck does lose some important cards. I think of the ones we've talked about so far, I think this one is the one that kind of needs the most help. And the reason for this is because Tormenting Voice and Chart Course were both very important for putting these Phoenixes into the yard. Now, obviously, we have Honor the Godpharaoh, which essentially acts as Tormenting Voice, except it costs 1 more additional mana. Gives you a 1/1, but this deck doesn't care about that. The fact that it costs additional mana sucks a lot. But as long as we get 1 red or blue spell that can put a card from hand into the graveyard for 2 mana, I think that this deck will still be fine. And as is, it's still an okay deck. And the reason it's still an okay deck is because you have access to Crackling Drake. And Crackling Drake may become a little bit less of an Arclight Phoenix style combo-esque deck, and it might be a little bit more of just good spells. Maybe throw in some Rowls into this deck again, and you do it that way, but you don't technically lose a bunch. The loss of Opt is actually relatively unfortunate. Let's do Instant Sorcery and 1-drop. So you do lose Opt, and there's not really anything else that's great for you. Essentially, there's like Unsummon, which doesn't do really what you need because you have Shock for that, right? So there are several issues with this deck. However, I think it's mitigated somewhat by being a relatively cheap deck. Now, obviously, you have Arclight Phoenix and Finale of Promise, which are both mythics, and then you have a rare here and a couple rare lands. But an investment of literally three sets of rares, and I don't even think this was at 4 of, and 2 sets of mythic, and once again I don't think this was at 4 of, I think is a pretty cheap deck to build, especially for one that can be explosive, and all we need is 1 or 2 cards to really help it out. Now, Lightning Strike being a loss is, I think, pretty lame. Not only does it make mono red a little bit worse, which I've hated mono red in the past. You can go back to my super old VODs when we're dealing with Bomat Couriers and stuff, but Lightning Strike did provide red aggro with enough pressure to keep the more controlling decks a little bit more in check than they otherwise would be. I do think if it were not for mono red, we would see even more really annoying flash decks or really annoying Esper style mid-range decks. But I think of the 3, this is the weakest one, and it's only because we kind of these 2 cards play a very pivotal role. That said, I do still think that this is a generally fine deck to build, and it can be modified to be slightly faster or slightly slower based on the cards that we have in Standard right now. Next up is Jeskai Super Friends. Jeskai Super Friends is very similar to the first deck, I think it was, because it's losing a decent amount. However, none of these cards are super required, right? So we'll talk really quickly about these. So Opt, again, this is an unfortunate card that they're losing because now you can't hold up a good old Steam Vents into Opt or Shock because we don't have a good 1-mana blue spell. I assume we're going to get one from Thorn of Eldraine. I don't know what it would be. I mean, even just another a reprinting of Opt would be fine. But losing that, little annoying, but it's fine. Spell Pierce, I think this was like a 1 of because we had Dovin's Veto, which is totally fine. The deck can run without Spell Pierces, and it can run other cheap instants that counter things instead. Baffling End shouldn't be too much of an issue. There's still plenty of good old-fashioned early game removal that a Jeskai deck can run. But then we get to Karn, Sign of Urza. Now, Karn was a 2/2 with Kasmina, and I think that's reasonable because they do very similar things. In this deck, for the most part, Karn is going to be providing you with card advantage. Now, because you're running Saheeli, you can obviously make relatively large Karn structs, but I've been kind of phasing Karn out a little bit because Kasmina is a little bit easier for people to acquire, being only an uncommon. So as a suggestion that people have asked me for whenever I have Karn in decks that are similar to this, I usually say Kasmina because she does a very similar thing. She provides you with a body as well as some card selection, and that is relatively helpful. Teferi leaving, I actually think is less of an issue than it would have been without 3-mana Teferi. So honestly, I mean, this deck was playing one of them anyway, and just playing 3 Sarkans instead. This deck could easily go up to a 4th Sarkhan or get another Planeswalker entirely. Maybe you throw in a 6-mana Chandra. You do something like that. But losing Sulphur Falls and Clifftop Retreat are okay because of the fact that this deck is running mostly Planeswalkers and then Interplanar Beacon. So the mana has never really been too terrible in this deck. And of course, their main deck is still fine. Having Shock, essentially what you're losing here is Opt for a little bit of card selection, and then Baffling End for a little bit more early game removal. But, you replace Baffling End with maybe a Lava Coil or something like that, depending, of course, on how the meta shakes up. Then you still have Shocks, Dovin's Vetoes, etc., etc. I realize there's no music, because the game just refuses to play music when you're in deck mode for some reason. Arena, it's great. But all the rest of these Planeswalkers stay, and Deafening Clarion is still a good removal spell. If you're needing more board wipes, you have access to things like Time Twist, Teferi's Time. whatever. Well, there's the music in the background. And then it stops. Boros Feather is not losing much, but what it is losing, I think is very important, is Reckless Rage. Reckless Rage is premier removal for this deck. Gideon, when he's a creature, doesn't take damage. Reckless Rage doesn't matter to him. 10th District Legionnaire, she gets bigger and likes to be hit with Reckless Rage. Oh my god, there's music. Dread Horde Arcanist can take the hit. Feather can take the hit. If you have to, Legion War Boss can go ahead and die. For what it's worth, you can actually just kill the 1/1 that comes out of Legion War Boss to deal the damage, but still. Losing Reckless Rage, I think, is the biggest impact that this deck has. That said, losing Sheltering Life, losing that indestructibility is a bit of an issue, right? Not being able to survive board wipes kind of sucks. That said, you know, we still have God's Willing. God's Willing's still pretty good. You know, we have Gideon. Gideon's, you know, in shuffle on your turn and stuff. But losing it down to Vanguard as well as Sheltering Light is an issue. Now, as the deck is, a good old-fashioned Boros deck is still going to do fine. You may see more of a movement into Naya because of the fact that we're losing Reckless Rage and Adanto Vanguard. We may move into Naya to get some of the other big buffs. Things like Collision Colossus, and maybe you throw in some other 2-drop that is just a general value card. I would not be surprised if we see black added for good old-fashioned Dreadhorde Butcher, because I love that card. I don't think there's a ton of black spells that are super great for this, but adding black does give you premium removal, and with Reckless Rage, that is something that you're going to be losing. That said, you still have access to the majority of your good instant sorceries that you want to cast on your creatures, and you still have almost all of your creatures. Really, you're just losing Adanto. The issue is Adanto does a very, very important job in that deck, being just the most aggressive, annoying piece of crap ever. Also, she's killing a dinosaur. How dare she? Yada, yada, yada. I think them losing Kleptocracy is a lot less of an issue because they're just a Boros deck, so it's not going to matter too much, but this deck keeps most of what it needs, so I think it's a relatively safe build, and of course, it has a lot of rares, but only one mythic, so it's not that bad. Then we get into the 2 top decks, and hilariously, these decks don't lose much. The deck loses Cast Down, which is fine because it's already started to be to get phased out by Legion's End because of how the meta shaped up. Now, I will say that I don't necessarily think that Legion's End is going to survive the changing metagame. It is very likely that Legion's End is a response to a lot of the Nisses and Field of Deads running around, and if those decks are less explosive, because they will be losing Lenoroil, they will be losing Scapeshift, then I can see Legion's End going a bit more back to the sideboard. But we do have other things in place of Cast Down. It should be fine. We lose Teferi. Once again, I think this deck played 1 or 2, because notably, this is just Esper Control. This is not Esper Hero. And I think that what this deck can do is merge with Esper Hero. Now, Esper Hero is not something that is losing. Obviously, this is just a card to remind myself to talk about Esper Hero. Now, as you can see, the main deck doesn't have as many value-generating cards, multicolor cards, for Esper Hero as the Esper Hero deck does. You know, it's obviously playing things like Disfigure, Elderspell, blah, blah, blah. But, you know, if you're getting rid of Legion's End and putting that in the sideboard, bringing back in Tyrant Scorn, it does a good job. The Elderspell, we'll still have to see if how well Jeskai Walkers does, how well Esper Walkers do, things like that. We'll still have to see how those decks do to decide if Elderspell is main deckable for this. But then you move on to here. You have these 3. Narset, decent, honestly, probably worth the keeping in. And then Bolos' Citadel probably you don't need, because that big advantage, that big card advantage engine, can be technically replaced by the fly Boros, or woman. That one, Elite Guard Mage. I don't know the names of cards. So yeah, I do think that this deck slightly merging with mid-range hero is going to be a good path for it. But they do lose Teferi, and Teferi is something relatively hard to deal with, and the loss of the mana base once again is going to be pretty difficult. Because of the fact that they're Esper, it means that they only have Temple of Silence. They don't have a blue-black or a white-blue temple. So it really depends on what Throne gives us to see if this deck's mana base can stick it, because they do have Basilica Bell Hunt. I still think they should play Command the Dreadhorde, yada yada yada. I still think they should be playing Narset, so we'll have to see about that. But I think in general, the core, which you can also mold into Esper Hero, the Esper core is still there. Whether or not you want to take it to the control route or the hero route or merge them both is up to you. But I do think that this is still a reasonable deck to build towards. Oath of Kai is still a very strong card. Mortify, still being able to destroy enchantments, is good. I have a hunch, and I'm not kidding, this is a hunch, that Throne of Eldraine is going to have not an enchantment theme, not an enchantment sub-theme, but I think there are going to be many interesting enchantments in that set. And I think these will be playable enchantments. Why do I think that? I don't know. The storybook set, it makes sense to me that there's going to be enchantments. I would love to see Sagas return, because it would make a lot of sense, except for the fact that, Sagas are called Sagas and not like stories. And they're historic. So Wizards may have shot themselves in the foot for being able to print those, but like the story structure of Sagas I think are really cool, and I would love to see them back again in Throne of Eldraine, because the storybook thing, it'd be really cool to have like the story of I don't know, try to think of a super easy one. Of course I can't. Story of Beauty and the Beast, right? The first saga part, the first lore counter, you like tap down a creature or a board or something. Then the second one, you like make a creature and it fights a non-tapped creature or something that's like the beast being like, eh. And then like you gain control of a creature that has power less than the beast or something. I don't know. I'm just trying to think of nonsense that kind of fits with the Beauty and the Beast story. It's something like that. I think it would be really cool and flavorful, and I like that type of stuff. So I think that'd be interesting. Anyway, this deck, whatever, is done. Shut up. And then last, but not least, Bantfield. Bantfield is losing some cards. Elvish Rejuvenator, we've talked about. Guild Guide? Guild Guide? Who cares? I don't care. The dumb guild card. That can be the replacement for this. But, and I think more likely, we'll see Risen Reef enter this deck. Now, Risen Reef, I think I've seen played in some of these variants already. But you can really easily just throw Risen Reef in for Elvish Rejuvenator. And in my opinion, it's already, like, better. And the reason for that is you don't get to look at the top 5. That's true. But if you whiff, you still at least get to draw a card, right? So I think that's fine. Cellular Wreckage, who cares? Honestly, you have time wipe. You can just play time wipe. Obviously, like, you're going to lose your own zombies and things like that, but time wipe still fine. Scape Shift is going away, but you still have Circuitous Roots, which I forgot to take down because I'm dumb, and you can still put in other ramp spells, right? You can still put other cards that just put basic lands, for example, onto the battlefield, and that still works totally fine. You can still just slowly play lands, right? And I think that's totally fine. Nisu Shakes the World. I think that this could become a Bant field ramp hybrid, where you're not just Bant ramp, you're not just playing Arboreal Grazers and a bunch of Mana Dorks to get up to Nissa and Hydrograces to win. But I could see a bit of a merging there. You throw in Nissa, you throw in Risen Reef, you throw in maybe a couple of Mass Manipulations, and then that shores up your deck for those situations where you aren't able to get a field out early. And then the rest of the time, you just have field out and you just generate value over time. You still have the majority of your basics. The majority of your lands, right? You still have the majority of those. You do lose some. Field of Ruin and Memorial to Genius I've talked about already. These, obviously, you're still going to need to get access to whatever Throne brings, but I don't think that this deck is going to be hit that hard because of the fact that, once again, the cards that you're already playing are fine by themselves. Arboreal Grazer, it blocks aggro decks while ramping you. Growth Spiral is still a good card. Also, that art by Seb, why is it so good? Krasis, Teferi, Circuitous Roots, all that is still fine, right? This is all still fine. You throw in a Risen Reef, you throw in some Nissa, and maybe some other cards, and bada bing, bada boom, you already have the list built, right? So I think this is another rally. It's another rally easy deck to make. He beat me straight up. Pay this man his monies. But yeah, I think this is another one of those decks that you can just have and it'll be fine. Now, I'm going to be very sad that Grixis, which is a spoiler for you all, because I'm playing Grixis for today's video, but that's in 12 hours, because this is my brain. But, that's Burn is dead. I don't know exactly how that deck's going to function. I'm hopping over to Goldfish right now real quick to once again remind myself why Burn is super dead. Vampires is one of the top decks that are just not going to exist because the main core of that is with Ixalan. Mono Red, I actually hopped to Jund Dinosaurs. A lot of the cards that Jund Dinosaurs needs are in Ixalan. Now I will say that this was kind of on the edge, because Marauding Raptor still is around, Riding Regisaur still is around, Shifting Ceratops is still around, right? Those cards are good, but you're losing like all of the dinosaur support. So even if you're running like a sub dino package, Jund Dinos is not going to survive. Mono Red loses so much. Firebrand, Lava Runner, Pyromancer, Chain Whirler, Lightning Strike, Wizard's Lightning. They lose all of that. Even out of the sideboard, they lose Dire Fleet, Daredevil. Right, like they lose a ton. Obviously, Wizard's Lightning can get replaced pretty easily by Skewer the Critics. I'm surprised that this was a 4th place at the SCG Open. That was a team open, so that may be why. Firebrand, maybe you... I don't see this deck surviving. Maybe it like has a light black splash where all of its cards are Rakdos, there's no like normal black. But it's very hard to see the deck survive with the number of cards, the sheer number of cards that are getting destroyed. That's a very cheap deck. I did not realize how inexpensive Mono Red was. Wow, that's crazy. Huh. Mono Red, $60. Esper Control, $400. Alright, but yeah, I'm very, very anxious, not anxious, excited for rotation. It cannot come too soon, even though I'm fairly certain rotation is happening way later than I want, so I'm just going to go and do what's in standard, and rotation occurs in a month, October 4th. We have an entire month to wait in this awful, awful situation. Whatever, it's fine. This is a bit of a bonus video, obviously, as kind of an apology for not having a video yesterday. Yes. Time travel's hard. I do hope you've enjoyed this. If you did, go ahead and tap that like button. It really does help. I'm not even kidding. No fun stuff here. Liking the video helps a lot because it shows Wizards that people care about my content. Or not Wizards, fuck. It does do that, but it shows YouTube that my content is, gets engaged. People watch it, and then of course YouTube gets ad money because that's all they care about now. They don't care about creators. Yeah, but liking the video makes YouTube show it to more people, which makes more people like the videos, which makes more people get shown it. Like, YouTube is such a feast or famine thing. Like, I'm not even kidding. It's ridiculous, but whatever. Yeah. Like the video, I hope. Let me know what decks you are planning on playing, or planning on like building for rotation, rotation proof decks, as it were, down in the comments. But yeah, until next time, I will be one.